A ceasefire in Gaza may have been announced, but the war surrounding who controls the narrative of events continues. For over a decade, MintPress has been at the forefront of this information war, popping the propaganda bubbles created by mainstream corporate media, exposing the profiteers and special interest groups driving public support for war. Now, in the past year alone, since Israel committed genocide in Gaza, we have exposed a network of Israeli spies from the elite IDF unit 8200, working within big tech, lobby groups, and within American corporate media newsrooms. Our investigations into Israeli attempts to manipulate the narrative around the Gaza genocide have all gone viral, and they've even drawn the ire of the Jerusalem Post. It's an Israeli state funded news outlet who recently attempted to cancel us. And just to introduce myself, I'm Manar Adli, founder and director of MintPress News, and joining me today to discuss our investigations into the Israeli spies within our media is the brilliant author of all of that research, Alan McLeod. Alan is a senior staff writer and podcast producer here at MintPress News. Welcome back, Alan.
It's great to be back with you, Manar. How are you?
Well, I would love to say that I'm doing great, but as a ceasefire has been announced in Gaza, it almost feels like, while there's a lot to celebrate that the war is over, it almost feels like deja vu from the Iraq war. The war is over, yet the war criminals and the architects of that war continue to walk free. And so while the people can take a break from their suffering, how can we expect that we are to forget the fact that a genocide was broadcasted live before our eyes for the past year? We became numb to the photos and images of dismembered children on our smartphones. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting that Netanyahu is walking free, Biden is walking free, just like the war criminals before us have walked free and are still walking free, like Tony Blair and Bush and Dick Cheney and other architects of these forever wars. And so I know I don't want to sound all grim because, there's a lot of people in Gaza that feel relief, but, something that we've done for the last year is we've actually stepped out of not just covering the war, but looking at how Israeli spies have infiltrated big tech, Silicon Valley big tech companies. They've infiltrated lobby groups and, Western corporate media outlets to control the narrative about what's happening in Gaza. And so I want to begin by this hit piece that was written about MintPress News by the Jerusalem Post. And actually, it wasn't just MintPress that was targeted in this article. It was also the Gray Zone and Red Media. This article claims that we are part of a network of foreign government-backed disinformation that pushed anti-Semitism and extremism. And if you actually look at the article from the Jerusalem Post, the title states, inside the far left media that backed by Moscow, Damascus, and Tehran attacks Israel. And it's really interesting to look at this article because the investigations that they specifically cite coming from MintPress News are all of our investigations revealing the Israeli spies that are working within US media. And so I would love, Alan, if you can talk to us a bit about what the Jerusalem Post said about MintPress and perhaps refute the claims and explain the context behind them.
The long and short of it is that they claimed that we were part of a foreign-backed nexus, backed by Russia, backed by Iran and Syria. It's quite a lavish conspiracy, thinking that we might be backed by all of these foreign governments. They said that, they didn't explicitly come out and say it because that would be libelous, but they used the vagaries of the English language to strongly insinuate that MintPress takes money from all of these different foreign governments, which is completely untrue. Now, people who have been on the anti-war movement for decades, or people who just oppose US militarism in general, have seen this slur being thrown about at media, at politicians, at activists for decades. So people who opposed the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011 were suddenly apologists for Colonel Gaddafi and his Viagra-fueled rape squads. Or if you go back further, people who opposed the US intervention in Iraq were actually secret supporters of Saddam Hussein. Or even further back, if you opposed the US bombing of Grenada or invasion of Vietnam, that meant you were a commie that was in league with Moscow and with Joseph Stalin or Leonid Brezhnev or whatever. This is a standard slur that's thrown around at people who actually stand up to empire and who critique it. So this has been going on for a very long time. And frankly, I'm quite surprised that the Jerusalem Post didn't throw in Venezuela and Cuba and China as well, because those are also countries that MintPress is apparently funded by, if you read the right publications. All of this is completely and utterly nonsensical, of course, but the fact that it does come from an established outlet does mean that we have to take notice of it. Now, one of the things that I found particularly ironic about this piece was it was, as you said, written in the Jerusalem Post, which, of course, has its own connections to state power. Its former editor-in-chief, Avi Meir, who was the head of the Jerusalem Post until recently, was actually the former project coordinator for the Office of the President of Israel and was the acting head of the IDF spokespersons unit for North America. And to this day, he's still an IDF reservist. Meir was succeeded by Zivka Klein, who is a former IDF spokesperson's unit commander. After leaving the military, he worked at the World Zionist Organization and actually was a government official and was in the office of the president of Israel, Reuven Rivlin. So the sort of people who work at the Jerusalem Post, these sorts of connections to foreign or to governments are much more clear when it comes to the Jerusalem Post. But the sort of I hate to call it evidence, but the sort of evidence they offered was absolutely laughable. And it came from sources like the Atlantic Council, which, let's not forget, is NATO's think tank and receives money from all sorts of foreign governments, the US, the UK, all the NATO countries, all the Middle Eastern dictatorships. And those were the experts they turned to try to insinuate that MintPress was somehow this foreign government disinformation and extremism outlet. They claimed that our cartoons by the amazing Carlos Latouche were anti-Semitic because they showed the Star of David. That's not actually true. We are very clear that we always use the flag of Israel rather than just the Star of David, specifically to refute those sorts of allegations and to make sure everybody knows that there is a difference between the religion of Judaism and the state of Israel that has put the Star of David on its flag. They also said that we are, a bunch of Assadists. And yet, later on in the article, they actually had to concede that we've actually been very critical of Assad of late. So the entire premise of the article really is as flimsy as can be. And yet, as we said, because it comes from a mainstream outlet, it's going to get picked up and read, and it's going to be used against us. So we have to fight back and counterpunch because we can't just sit here and be punching bags because alternative media, we have to fight our corner because no one else is going to do that for us.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to just read a little bit here from the article from the very beginning. It says, the first sentence actually, which says a lot, is it's linking to our investigation. Revealed, the Israel lobbyist writing America's news is the first headline of the supposed scoop published on November 12th. And just a month later, a similar story claimed that it was in fact Israeli spies who were writing America's news. In both cases, the evidence was flimsy at best. In the former, a brief internship at AIPAC during college was all it took to be a part of an ominous conspiracy to control the media. In the latter, a previous stint as a reservist in Unit 8200 of the IDF's Intelligence Corps was more than sufficient to brand a journalistic security analysis as a clandestine psychological operation. And of course, the author, which we're going to talk more about, whose name is Nicholas Potter, is referring to these two investigations that you wrote for MintPress. The articles were published on MintPress News, a far-left, Minneapolis-based website founded in 2012 by Manar Adli, and they are just two examples of the website's steep ideological slant, which has mixed anti-Israel narratives with pro-Assad and pro-Putin propaganda. And the reason I wanted to read this opening intro of this article is because of the way our investigations were described as flimsy, right? And as not having strong enough evidence that somebody being in Israeli Unit 8200 could possibly be a spy. But that's literally what this elite Israeli Unit 8200 is. It's a spy, it's the spying arm of the IDF. And so, talk to me, Alan, about Unit 8200. Its importance, its significance, and why this opening statement for this article by the Jerusalem Post is literally just BS.
To begin with, it's BS because the Jerusalem Post itself actually describes Unit 8200's function as spying on Palestinians. So the newspaper itself has already identified this group as a spying group. And the reason I use the word spying group, journalists think about the words we use very carefully. And I found that many of the biggest publications in the entire world, including the New York Times, the Guardian, the BBC, any publication that you've heard of, a global publication, has identified Unit 8200 as a spying group, because that's exactly what it is. It is the largest and most controversial group within the Israeli military. The reason it's controversial is because it's really the centerpiece of Israel's high-tech surveillance empire that it uses globally and specifically against the Palestinian population. Palestinians, for example, who live in Gaza have to go through, or the West Bank for that matter, have to go through a series of checkpoints constantly. Their every move, whether they're inside or outside, but specifically outside, is tracked by cameras that have been put up everywhere. This facial recognition technology follows them everywhere. And so when they get to checkpoints, very often the Israeli soldiers call them out by name because they already know who it is, because the Israeli government has this gigantic database of information on every Palestinian. And they use this to exert pressure and influence on the Palestinian population. If you're a Palestinian, your calls are monitored, your texts are monitored, everything you say online is recorded and is looked at specifically by Unit 8200. And it's used as compromise. So, for example, if you're a Palestinian and you're cheating on your spouse or you're secretly closeted gay, Unit 8200 will know that, and they will use that information against you to try and turn you into an informant against other people. In fact, one whistleblower from Unit 8200 who came forward said that as part of their standard training, they were told to memorize all the different Arabic slang words for gay so they could look out for them in conversation. Even more importantly, and I know you know this personally, the amount of AI-powered technology that is levied against Palestinians is incredible. Today, the Israeli military and Unit 8200 specifically have these AI-powered robot guns at so many checkpoints, which can, without human interference, actually shoot at people. So you kind of got, if you're a Palestinian, you've got a gun pointed at your head every time you go close to one of these checkpoints. Unit 8200 also is the centerpiece of the Israeli bombardment of Gaza. They were using a very infamous and notorious piece of technology called Project Lavender, which was an AI-powered hit list, which basically assigned a numerical value to every citizen of Gaza from 0 to 100. And the higher the number, the more this AI database thought you were likely to be a member of Hamas. And the things that made you more likely to be a member of Hamas was staying in the same building as someone from Hamas, being in a group chat with a Hamas member. These are the sorts of things that they were basing their decisions on. And if your number reached a certain threshold, the AI would automatically put you on a kill list. And that's why there were the destruction of Gaza was absolutely monumental in the first few months of that bombardment, because the Israeli military actually could never have had these sorts of human-powered kill lists. They would have run out of targets immediately. But Project Lavender, which Unit 8200 used, allowed them to continue the bombardment and find more targets all the time. And it only stopped working because so many Palestinians were actually driven from their homes and had to be forced into refugee camps. Unit 8200 was also behind the infamous Lebanon pager attack, which happened recently, which injured thousands of civilians and killed more than 10 Lebanese citizens as well. And furthermore, they are behind some of the most controversial global spyware that's been out there in the last 20 years, including the notorious Pegasus software, which was used to spy on foreign diplomats, foreign politicians, journalists, activists, heads of state, members of royal families, and it even included the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Unit 8200, along with the Israeli government, sold this technology to the government of Saudi Arabia, who was using it to track Khashoggi, and then he was dismembered with a bone saw inside the Saudi embassy in Turkey. So this is the group we're talking about when we're talking about Unit 8200. And that is why it is entirely inappropriate for people from Unit 8200 to be working in foreign news organizations. And so quite simply, I was trying to raise the alarm by saying these people are actually deciding what Americans
Dangerous.
read and what
Yeah.
they read and what they don't read on all sorts of topics, including the Middle East. We should, at very least, know about this. I think that's an absolute basic level that we should have in our democracy, and we should be having a discussion about what Unit 8200 is and whether it's appropriate if former members of this organization are working as journalists.
Well, and what you just presented, Alan, doesn't sound like flimsy research. I mean, that's quite solid, in depth research about who Unit 8200 is and why we as Americans and just citizens of the world should be concerned that these are the people that are writing our news. They're in charge of, they've infiltrated big tech and they've committed terrorist attacks. They've assassinated foreign officials. They're spying on Palestinians. And so this is a very dangerous group. And so I want to go into the author here of this article by the Jerusalem Post, Nicholas Potter. I mean, he is an important character in all of this. He's not your, small town Israeli writer. He has backing by the German government and the Israeli state. So just the irony of him trying to paint us as Russian backed or Assadist backed or Syrian backed or Iranian backed is just so ironic. And I just want to point out that in this Jerusalem Post article, if you are to read it, they actually mention that our all of our public fundraising campaigns as well, which is just so funny. Could you tell us who Nicholas Potter is and how he fits into this narrative?
Yeah, that's one thing that's another deep irony of this entire situation is Nicholas Potter is not an Israeli, he's not an American, he's actually a German citizen. He is a German guy a journalist who presents himself as a counter-extremism expert. And in the middle of a genocide going on in Gaza, he decided to move to Israel to study extremism. And yet he can't see he has never written about any Israeli extremism. He can't see any extremism coming from Israel. In fact, he decided to fly over there and go and live there. So he moves to Israel to work for the Jerusalem Post, which is a newspaper which has promoted some of the most outrageous extremist views ever written since the end of World War II. Quite frankly, I mean, the Jerusalem Post was one of the major newspapers pushing the 40 beheaded babies hoax. They, for instance, published an article claiming that this famous picture of a dead Palestinian baby was actually a doll, and the person holding it, the father grieving, was some sort of paid actor. The Jerusalem Post editorial board constantly support the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the Israeli military taking Gaza, moving into Syria. They wrote an article recently that was called Southern Lebanon is actually Northern Israel, just to give you a flavor of what the Jerusalem Post is about. And yet this German guy just rocks up there, a counter-extremism expert, and decides that the real problem in this area is small independent outlets like MintPress or the Grey Zone, who are criticizing the Israeli government. He's also very, very concerned about foreign governments funding journalism in general, which, maybe there's something wrong with that, maybe there isn't. But the very fact of the matter is that Nicholas Potter himself is funded by a foreign government. His trip to Israel and his job at the Jerusalem Post is actually specifically funded by the German government. He is the Ernst Kramer and Teddy Kollek Fellow of International Journalism, which is a post funded by the German Federal Foreign Office. The head of this fellowship is Frank Dieter Freiling, who is the senior vice president of ZDF, which is the German state broadcaster. And Potter has a long history of working for groups and outlets sponsored by the German government as well. So there are just so many layers of irony to this. Somebody writing in the Jerusalem Post about extremism, a guy who is openly funded by a foreign government talking about outlets that receive no foreign government funding, but casting aspersions on us. I mean, I don't even know where to begin with this story. It's just ridiculous all the way down.
Well, I think he said it quite clearly in his article why he targeted MintPress. And he did say that MintPress was the most effective independent media outlet. And so I think that just says it all, is because of how effective we have been in exposing this web of Israeli influence within the United States. And we've really been the only media outlet that has really put an eye on this elite Israeli spying agency, Unit 8200. I mean, he said it clearly. MintPress is the most effective in spreading this information and presenting it. And so I think we get a pat on the back for that. And Alan, we thank you for leading these investigations and exposing that. I mean, isn't that what journalism is meant to be in an active democracy? I mean, of course, we know that the United States is not really a democracy anymore. Study after study has shown us that the United States is an oligarchy. The power is in the hands of the 1% billionaire. Can we even say billionaire elite anymore? Is it like trillionaire elite? So this is, the power lies in the hands of those very few elite, rich people within our establishment. But the role of journalism truly is to educate the public about corruption and the people who are in charge, to provide the public with pertinent information so that we can make the best decisions at the voting polls. And so that's what our investigative journalism has done. And, we don't always respond to every single attack that we get, but just the irony of this attack specifically by a government funded agent, we can call him an agent, I guess, right? He really is an agent of the state of Germany and Israel as well. And it's coming from an Israeli funded and connected media outlet accusing independent media and journalism of being foreign backed because we have been critical of US funded war crimes. We've been doing this since the very beginning of MintPress, looking at this trail of money and special influence and the special interest groups and the profiteers, how they use the media to manufacture consent to promote war. That's what we've been doing for over a decade. And so, yes, we've continued to get attacked. We've had our Wikipedia page written and rewritten by pro-war, pro-NATO, pro-Israel, pro-Venezuela opposition organizations and people. But we wear this as a badge of honor. We will continue to expose them, and we will continue to hold the war establishment accountable. I cannot sit back. I know you can't sit back, but we as journalists in the independent media world, and me as myself as a survivor of Israeli occupation and apartheid, who witnessed as a child and a teenager war crimes committed by the apartheid state of Israel. I'm a survivor. I have the privilege of being an American, to live in this country, to use my voice, to be able to create this platform, MintPress, to continue to expose, the inner workings of how these wars are manufactured and justified. But I cannot sit back and allow another child to be killed, another woman to be left widowed, another father to be killed, another boy, baby boy, to be left without parents with their limbs blown off. We saw that in Iraq, we saw that in Libya, we saw that in Yemen. We've been seeing that through US regime change operations across Africa and South America and within the Middle East. And we will continue to do that. We will continue to do our work as journalists to expose these people because it's the least that we can do. It's the skill set that we have. It's the least that we can do. And so we're proud of the work that we do. And if that means getting smeared and attacked and being labeled with these McCarthyist style smears of being, pro Russia or pro Putin or pro Iran or pro Syria, whatever it is, we don't care. These are just words. And as they say, our work in media is far mightier than the sword. And so this article that you published exposing how Unit 8200 has infiltrated, American media is actually part of a series of investigations that you've published, Alan, looking at these people within media, within lobby groups, within big tech. And so why don't you talk to us about Israel lobbyists and the connection between the Israel lobbyists and the US corporate media? And can you give us some names of people that we should, be looking out for and just know that this person is literally an Israeli spy?
Yeah, sure. So first, I just want to comment on what you said. I very much subscribe to the idea that journalism is really about publishing things that powerful people don't want people to know, right? Everything else is kind of just PR nonsense. Nicholas Potter doesn't think that because he just recently wrote an article in German called "Can Journalists Be Terrorists?" where he's basically downplaying the killing of hundreds of Palestinian journalists and suggesting that, well, the line between journalist and activist is really diaphanous, and maybe it's all right, to, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, knock them off. But yeah, there are actually, we've been talking about Unit 8200 for a while. There are actually a considerable number of Unit 8200 spies actually working in the American media. And that goes, it's very high positions. Let's take one, for example, Barak Ravid of Axios. Now, he is a very influential journalist in the United States. In fact, he's one of the most important political journalists out there. He won the White House Press Correspondence Award last year, which is basically like the World Cup or the Oscars of political journalism. He was on stage in Washington, D.C., and he was actually presented the trophy by President Biden himself, who hugged him on stage. And Ravid's work over the past couple of years has really all been about trying to distance the American presidency and Joe Biden in particular from the horrors of what's going on in Gaza. All of his articles they're all about, saying Biden is very angry at Netanyahu, or Biden is going to take a stand. Biden is very frustrated with what's going on in Israel. Biden wants peace to come. All of this is utterly nonsense. When you look at people's actions, Biden has kept the weapons flowing. The support at international bodies like the UN has been rock solid. So this idea that Biden is, distancing himself from Netanyahu is utterly nonsensical. But here's the thing. Here's the real kicker. Barak Ravid is an Israeli spy, or at least he was until at very least last year, because he was an analyst serving in Unit 8200. And we know he was a reservist until at very least last year when he announced that he might be leaving Unit 8200 finally. But this is a guy who is actually deciding what Americans know and what they don't know about the Middle East conflict more generally. And this is a guy who, as I said, was part of Unit 8200 for a very long time. But he's not the only one. We can talk about all sorts of people. Sasha Paled, for example, was a team leader at Unit 8200. She specialized in intelligence, surveillance, and cyber warfare. She then left Unit 8200 to become an agent of Shin Bet, which is another Israeli intelligence organization, a domestic intelligence organization. And then in 2017, she was hired by CNN to become a writer and producer for some of their most influential political shows, including Fareed Zakaria's show and Christine Amanpour's show as well. And Khaled is not the only former Unit 8200 official working at CNN. We could talk about Tal Heinrich, for example, who was employed by CNN during Operation Protective Edge. She was working at the Jerusalem Bureau, the famously pro-Israel Jerusalem Bureau for CNN, where she was very much in control of what CNN put out with regards to the bombardment of Gaza, which at the time was almost historic. It's now been eclipsed by what's been going on in the last 2 years. She left that position and now is currently the official spokesperson for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. So her career path has gone from Israeli intelligence services like Unit 8200 and Shin Bet to CNN and to now literally being the mouthpiece of Benjamin Netanyahu. I would say, is that appropriate? What does that say about our media? As I said, the Jerusalem Post hates using the word spy, but even they use it when it comes to that. And that's not all, right? We're talking about spies, but there's actually a network of hundreds of people who used to be former Israeli lobbyists in the Israel lobby who now work in high positions in corporate media. Now, I could talk to you for, I don't know, like an hour or two, just giving you example after example from so many outlets, from the New York Times to Fox News to the Washington Post to CNN to wherever. But maybe I'll just stick to a couple of examples from NBC and MSNBC in particular, which is supposed to be the most left-wing, liberal outlet that we've got in the United States. But when you look at who actually works at the NBC Universal empire, a very large amount of them used to be lobbyists for the state of Israel or as part of the Israel lobby. Let's take Gili Malinsky, for example, the lead work reporter at CNBC. She was a commander in the IDF and specifically in their public relations department. Then she moved to the United States and worked for the Friends of the IDF, which is a quote unquote charity which raises funds to buy supplies for active duty IDF soldiers who are fighting in Gaza and in Lebanon right now. She's even covered Israel for CNBC. Brandon Glantz, the NBC Universal Senior Director of Global Privacy Operations, used to work for Hillel International, which a lot of the time describes itself as just, the Jewish group on campus. But Glantz's own resume on LinkedIn says that what he was doing at Hillel was, quote, conducting all Israel advocacy on campus, end quote. So he's very helpfully saying that he was an agent of Israel while on campus. Noah Even, who's a manager at NBC Universal until 2018, she worked for Stand With Us. She organized speaking tours of IDF soldiers to come around the United States and propagandize universities and schools, talking about, how great and how it's the most moral army in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And why is this allowed at NBC Universal? Well, maybe it's because Moshe Arenstein, who's MSNBC's executive producer, was a former IDF intelligence commander in his youth. So I'd ask you, what sort of atmosphere do you think this breeds when even the quote-unquote liberal left media in the United States is headed by former IDF officers? What sort of message does that send? We know from leaked files and emails that places like the New York Times and CNN have sent memos to their staff instructing them how to cover Israel-Palestine. In the New York Times case, they said that reporters aren't allowed to use words like occupation, refugee camp. They're not even allowed to use the word Palestine in most contexts. And so that means that they're really being told this is how you're supposed to cover this conflict. I'm not suggesting that this is some sort of grand conspiracy like the Israeli military are trying to infiltrate or the pro-Israel lobby are trying to infiltrate American media. But what I am saying is that we've got a society where being paid lobbyist for the state of Israel in the Israel lobby is kind of an unremarkable career choice. It's a little bit like being ex-military in the United States. It's not considered problematic or a career ender if you used to work for APAC or if you used to work for the IDF. You can, doors are still open to you at CNN and the New York Times or wherever. And this is one of the reasons why coverage in the United States from corporate media is just unbelievably slanted. Newsrooms across America have literal former paid employees of the Israel lobby in their newsrooms, helping to decide how coverage is framed. And that is why we have such absolutely ludicrous coverage. And that's what, of course, why people turn to alternative media like MintPress to try to find an antidote to the lies that they're being served up in corporate media. They're looking for a much more balanced, neutral, or frankly, just truthful account of what's going on over in Palestine right now.
Well, and there you have it. I mean, it's really not a conspiracy. There are lobbyists and Israeli spies that have infiltrated American newsrooms and websites and organizations who are writing America's news to toe a specific line. And so, what's really great about your research and your investigations, Alan, is that everything that you cite is public information on these people's LinkedIn profiles. And so it's not like, all of this stuff is public information. And so for those looking for the research, you can go onto our website. And this specific investigation that we are now referring to is called Revealed, the Israel lobbyists writing America's news. And we're going to have that posted within this video. Another thing about this investigation is that you have the names, you have the links of all of these people and their profiles. And so it's really, really, just out in the open, but in a way where the average person can't necessarily find the information because they're not probably looking for it in the way that we are, and putting it together in this like comprehensive investigation, these reports, and presenting it through these journalistic articles. And so these are really, really good investigations to bookmark when you're having debates, for research, for presentations, for talking points. Whenever I give presentations, I do cite a lot of our own investigations at MintPress. They're quite helpful. And so a lot of what we're talking about, Alan, reminds me about the recent Rafi Berg scandal at the BBC. Now, you've written actually about the NATO to BBC pipeline for MintPress, where NATO, people associated with NATO and funded by NATO, warmongers, and even spies have become editors and reporters within the BBC. And so recently, Rafi Berg, who is the BBC's senior Middle East editor, and multiple current and past BBC employees have come out to complain that he systematically distorts their work to put a pro-Israel slant on the news. And, for those who have followed MintPress, it's not just, American corporate media. Of course, this infiltration of pro-Israel people is happening in Canada and in many places in Europe, like you talked about Germany, but of course, within the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, the British state, which is working in partnership, the UK working in partnership with the United States to fund and promote these wars. And of course, we know that Great Britain was arming Israel actively while it was bombing Gaza. And also, Britain is home to Israel's largest arms manufacturer, Elbit Systems. So it wouldn't be too much surprise to find out that the BBC is employing as their senior Middle East editor, the person in charge of all of the coverage about the Middle East, to be, to provide a pro-Israel slant that he himself is connected to possibly the CIA and Mossad. And so your investigation found something very sinister about him that most people don't know. And so why don't you break it down for us who Rafi Berg is at the BBC?
I mean, I guess I guess people have been complaining about the BBC's coverage of Israel-Palestine for decades. In fact, 2 decades ago, my former supervisor at the University of Glasgow, Greg Philo, wrote an entire book called Bad News from Israel, which is specifically detailing how the BBC and other networks distort the coverage of what's going on in the Middle East to fit a pro-Israel narrative. But Berg in particular has been this center of a small storm recently when, as you said, more than a dozen BBC employees came forward saying that he distorts their words and puts a pro-Israel slant on everything. But what I found, which I think really should have been a much, much bigger story covered by big outlets, is that Berg is actually a former employee of the US State Department, their Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which is a group that which is understood the world over to be a CIA front group. And that's not me saying that. That is actually Rafi Berg himself saying that. In multiple interviews that he's given, he has said that he was told that he is secretly working for the CIA, but don't go telling people. And his reaction was that he was absolutely thrilled by this because he's so interested in the world of cloak and dagger politics. So here's a guy who admits to being more or less a secret CIA agent for his earlier career and is going into the British state broadcaster to work there and to cover the Middle East. That already should ring gigantic alarm bells. But not only that, he is also, in his own words, a Mossad collaborator. Again, he wrote the book Red Sea Spies, The True Story of Mossad's Fake Diving Resort. And that story was given to him by senior members of the Mossad. He talks about one guy, Danny Limor, who was a senior Mossad commander, who became one of his closest friends, and he worked hand in hand with Limor on this book. You can see, in fact, when Berg does interviews, and of course he's the senior Middle East editor for the BBC, so he's constantly on Zoom calls, being, his picture, his face is being broadcast around the world, right? The office in which he chooses to be interviewed for this, you can see on the wall with pictures of him glad handing and even embracing Israelis in the photo that I identified as Mossad commanders. There's also a very famous tweet from him talking about his glee that Benjamin Netanyahu has actually read his book and has endorsed the book Red Sea Spies. There's pictures of him with Netanyahu as well. I'm sorry, not with Netanyahu, with Mark Regev, who was the former spokesperson for the Israeli Prime Minister's office and the ambassador of Israel to the United Kingdom. So this is a person whose whole job is to cover Israel-Palestine, and yet he feels comfortable enough to broadcast to the world pictures of him. Imagine if there was a picture of me with Hassan Nasrallah and I'm hugging him behind him, or Yahya Sinwar, and it's me and him glad handing. People would think that would be astonishing that I would be that biased, or that I'd even met these people. But Rafi Berg just comes out and he thinks that's not only unremarkable, but he's proud of his connections to Israel and the Mossad. He appears to think that's unproblematic, that he has, one hair's breadth away from the Mossad himself, and yet he is being tasked with covering the Middle East for one of the largest and most important news networks in the world. And I think that says volumes about what the BBC is, what its agenda is, how it sees itself in the world, and frankly, how much attention we should be paying and how much credence we should be paying to their reports about the Middle East. And I think this sort of information, we can really glean a lot about why the BBC chooses the sorts of words it does, why the BBC presents one side of the story in this way and another in a completely different way, and why it's been criticized for decades for being a one-sided mouthpiece of the state of Israel when it comes to the Middle East. And it's people like Berg which really show that in stark contrast. But the fact that, as I said, he's been a Mossad collaborator and pretty much a paid employee of the CIA, about one step away from that. And yet this is completely public knowledge, by the way, and yet he still manages to climb all the way up to the top of the BBC. I think that speaks volumes to about what Britain's state broadcaster is really all about.
Well, I'm glad that Bibi Netanyahu has the time to read this book, Red Sea Spies, in between his commands to bomb children and his corruption charges. That says a lot about his priorities and the place that Rafi Berg sits in Netanyahu's life. It really
Yeah,
is
I mean,
interesting.
listen, I
Yep.
should say that Berg actually has a signed letter of recommendation from Netanyahu on his wall as well, beside all the ones with him and the Mossad as well.
Another spy working as a senior Middle East editor at the BBC. And I want to move on to talk a little bit about TikTok because TikTok has been presented as this like Chinese Trojan horse, and we have to shut it down because China, China, China. When in reality, we know that TikTok has become this platform where people have come out to support Palestinians and to come out and support, or not support, but to oppose Israeli occupation and apartheid. And so TikTok has been this platform where young people have been, coming out to see Israel's genocide live in action. And so the powers that be have seen that TikTok truly can be used as a weapon to kind of flip the narrative. And so, talk to me a little bit about the attempts to silence Palestinian voices on social media and how this Chinese Trojan horse has been used to hide like a bigger agenda for, using TikTok to promote war to a younger generation.
Yeah, I mean, we like to think of social media as these companies that are international and they exist only in the ether. But in fact, they are enormously powerful American companies for the most part, headquartered in California and have to comply with American laws and have very close relationships with the US national security state. And that has been it's been going that way for many years. You know, in 2018, Facebook announced that it was going to partner with the Atlantic Council, which is NATO's think tank. Then they brought in a whole bunch of former CIA agents. You can read about that at MintPress if you just type MintPress Facebook CIA into Google. I'm sure you'll find some interesting articles. And TikTok's really no different, although of course it was not started in the United States. And TikTok has come under extraordinary pressure from the US government and the US national security state to try and toe a specific line when it comes to Israel Palestine. The algorithm for TikTok is absolutely clear that it is not quite as censorious as other platforms such as Instagram, which has just seen mass bannings of Palestinian voices. Same with Facebook, same with even Twitter. We ourselves at MintPress have found ourselves algorithmically suppressed for years, including on TikTok, by the way, who deleted our account. TikTok has tried to ward off this sort of attack on its platform by the United States by trying to placate the U.S. government. They launched something called Project Texas in 2020, which was essentially to move all of the American users' data into a big database in Texas, working alongside Oracle, which is a quote unquote private company which works very closely with the US government and specifically with the CIA. It even started hiring NATO and State Department officials to senior roles within the company, specifically roles that would allow them to have some sort of measure of control over the algorithm. But even that doesn't seem to be enough for the Biden and perhaps even the Trump administration. Biden, of course, famously banned TikTok in January. That ban was rescinded, but as we're speaking right now, the whole situation is very much up in the air. It's absolutely clear that the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, wants to force through the sale of TikTok to an American company because they don't want that sort of challenge from a foreign competitor. They want to be able to control the entire means of communication online. And that's really what's been going on over the past few years, that the United States government has become increasingly close to Silicon Valley. They have agents working in high positions at Facebook, in Twitter, in Instagram, all of the big companies. And TikTok's no different. There are state officials working there. You can find this sort of information in articles like the NATO to TikTok pipeline that I wrote for MintPress, or even, for example, TikTok, the Chinese Trojan horse run by State Department officials. One example of a State Department official working at TikTok is Jade Nestor. Before being recruited to the head of data public policy Europe for TikTok, she was a senior official in Washington. She served for 4 years as the State Department's director of internet public policy, and now she's parachuted into TikTok to basically do the job she was doing there. TikTok's even actually hired a whole bunch of Unit 8200 agents as well to run its internal affairs. I wrote an entire article about that as well. One example of this is Rayot Medallion, who enjoyed quite a long career at Unit 8200, serving as an intelligence commander. And she was actually the head of the cybersecurity operations team at Unit 8200. And in the wake of Israel's attack on Gaza, she moved to New York City to become a global incident manager for TikTok's Trust and Safety division. Now, considering the events that were going on in late 2023, right after October 7th, it's fair to wonder what sort of global incidents this Israeli military intelligence commander is actually overseeing for TikTok. What's going on there? TikTok, in short, is not nearly as pro-Palestine as you might think. People point to studies that show that, there's vastly more pro-Palestine sentiment on TikTok than pro-Israel sentiment. But that's just a reflection of the globe more generally. Look at the United Nations votes. All of the votes condemning Israel and supporting Palestine, they pass with margins like 188 to 2, 185 to 3, etc. The entire world, when you talk about governments and even and especially populations, is behind the Palestinian people. And so the US government, who are very much not on that side, have been trying to silence that. And part of that has been this convergence between the pro-Israel faction in Washington and the anti-China faction coming together to try to ban this platform, or at least force this platform to sell up to an American bidder, so they can try and turn it into a very safe place where pro-Israel sentiment is dominant and Palestinian voices are silenced, like they are on Facebook.
And Alan, for those who have made it this far into this conversation, I should have made the plug earlier, but this is just another reason why it's so important to support independent media, to become a member on our Patreon and to help continue to fund like programs like this where we do our podcasts. The Jerusalem Post, made some pretty blatantly false accusations against us. But the truth is that, most of our funding at MintPress is from our readers and our viewers. And so we rely heavily on everybody's support. And so in your investigations uncovering, the motivation to shut down TikTok, you've actually figured out and found that not only are there State Department and CIA officials, former State Department and former CIA officials working within TikTok to run a lot of their affairs, but you actually, again, found Israeli spies to run its internal affairs. So let's wrap up the conversation with this final point about Israeli spies working within TikTok to run their internal affairs, and why TikTok.
So in addition to Rayot Medallion, there's a whole bunch of them. Asaf Hochman, for example, was a long-time veteran of Unit 8200, spending years there. And in 2021, Hochman was hired as the global head of product strategy and operations for TikTok. He now works actually at Meta, the parent company of Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. But there's many examples of this. Omar Kameli, for example, is TikTok's global marketing manager, but between 2004 and 2007, he was a field operations specialist with Unit 8200, serving throughout the 2006 Operation Summer Rains, which was the IDF's 4-month attack on Gaza. So TikTok is not immune to this process, which we've seen with all the other big social media platforms, which is agents of US and Israeli intelligence have been parachuted into senior positions in platforms in order to try and control the narrative. The fact of the matter is that these platforms are extraordinarily important and influential. If you think about the reach that somewhere like the New York Times has, um, it's absolutely nothing in comparison to the big platforms like Facebook, like TikTok, etc. And I should say that all the people I found, as I said, they're a matter of public record. You can go on employment databases like ZoomInfo and LinkedIn and find these people. And I should say that this is probably just a small smattering of the actual number, because under Israeli law, it's actually an offense to reveal that you are a member of Unit 8200. So all of these people that I found are actually skirting Israeli law by advertising the fact that they used to be spies for Unit 8200 and are now working in media, social media, or in other important positions in society. So I think this should be at least the start of a conversation we should be having about this. And I think hopefully we can take this forward in the future.
Amazing, amazing research, Alan. And we apologize for any technical difficulties. I think your video got stuck on one frame, Alan, while you were talking towards the end, but at least we got most of your solid video from the very beginning of this conversation. So we want to thank everybody for joining us and for listening to Alan present all of his research and our response to the absolutely ridiculous article and hit piece in the Jerusalem Post in attempt to cancel MintPress. So please check out the reporting. We'll be linking a lot of this within the video itself. And we appreciate everybody for listening to us today. And Alan, thank you so much for joining us and presenting all of this. And until then, we will see everybody next week. Thank you.